I didn't expect Julia Brennan to save my life that Tuesday morning. But then again, I didn't know I needed saving. She caught me in the hallway of our apartment building, balancing a broken coffee maker and a stack of work files that were about to slide everywhere. Her smile was quick and genuine as she grabbed the files before gravity could scatter them across the worn carpet. That small gesture marked the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. My name is David Harper, and for 3 years I'd been living like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant, just trying to make it through each day without drowning completely. Portland had become my refuge after everything fell apart in Eugene. The rain here felt appropriate, matching the gray weight I carried inside. I worked as a software engineer from my apartment most days, solving problems through screens while avoiding the messier complications of actual human connection. Julia lived in the unit next to mine, close enough that I could hear her music through the walls sometimes, soft jazz that made the evenings feel less empty. She was a freelance graphic designer, which meant her schedule was as unpredictable as mine was rigid. We'd started with polite nods in the hallway, then brief conversations about the building's terrible heating system, then gradually something that resembled friendship. She'd knock on my door when she needed help reaching something on a high shelf. I'd text her when I accidentally ordered too much Chinese food. Simple exchanges that felt safe because they had clear boundaries. What made Julia different from other people I'd met since moving here was her patience. She never pushed. When I deflected personal questions, she'd just smile and change the subject. When I made excuses about being busy, she'd say maybe next time without any edge in her voice. Most people gave up after a few attempts. Julia seemed content to exist in my orbit without demanding I let her closer. That should have been my first warning that she was dangerous to my carefully maintained distance. The coffee maker incident happened on a morning when everything felt particularly heavy. I'd woken up thinking about Emma, which still happened more often than I wanted to admit. 3 years since I'd lost her, and some mornings the grief felt as fresh as the day the doctor had told me there was nothing more they could do. I was trying to get to work, trying to focus on code and deadlines instead of memories, when the handle of my old coffee maker just snapped off in my hand. It was such a small, stupid thing, but it felt like the final straw in a series of small failures. Julia appeared exactly when I was standing there in the hallway, probably looking more defeated than one broken appliance warranted. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just helped me carry everything back inside, then offered to make coffee at her place while I got situated for my morning meeting. I should have said no. I'd gotten very good at saying no to invitations, even innocent ones. But something about the way she asked made it feel less like an intrusion and more like a life raft. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine in layout, but completely different in feeling. Where my space was minimal and carefully neutral, hers had color everywhere. Art prints on the walls, plants crowding the windowsills, throw pillows in patterns that shouldn't have worked together but somehow did. It felt like a place where someone actually lived instead of just existed. She made coffee in a French press, the real kind that required attention and care, and we sat at her small kitchen table while I logged into my laptop for a status meeting. That became our routine. Sunday morning coffee at her place evolved into occasional weeknight dinners, helping each other with groceries, watching movies when neither of us felt like being alone but didn't want to deal with crowds. Julia introduced me to hiking trails I'd never have found on my own, places where the forest felt ancient and peaceful. I helped her move furniture and troubleshoot technical problems with her computer. We fell into the kind of easy companionship that felt rare and valuable, the kind where silence wasn't awkward and conversation didn't require performance. But there were limits, invisible lines I'd drawn that Julia seemed to sense without me explaining them. She talked about her work, her friends, her family back in California. I listened and asked questions and offered opinions. When she asked about my life before Portland, I gave her the basics without detail. Engineering degree from University of Oregon. A few years working in Eugene before the move. Generic facts that revealed nothing important. She noticed my deflections. I could tell from the way her expression would shift slightly, curiosity mixed with concern. But she never pressed. Her friends were less subtle. Julia occasionally invited me to group dinners or game nights, and her social circle clearly found my presence puzzling. They'd ask direct questions about my dating life, make jokes about setting me up with someone, hint broadly about various single people they knew. I became an expert at redirecting these conversations, turning questions back on the asker, making self-deprecating comments about being married to my work. Julia would catch my eye across the room during these moments, a silent apology in her expression, and later she'd say sorry about them. They mean well. I'd tell her it was fine, which was mostly true. Her friends cared about her, and they probably wondered why she spent so much time with someone who kept everyone at arm's length. What I couldn't explain to them, what I barely understood myself, was that Julia's presence had become essential in a way that terrified me. She was the only person since Emma who made me feel less alone without demanding I explain the emptiness. Our friendship existed in a space that felt sustainable, manageable. I could care about her without risking the kind of devastation that had nearly destroyed me 3 years ago. Or at least, that's what I told myself during the long stretches between our hangouts when I'd analyze every interaction, looking for signs that things were shifting into territory I couldn't handle. The spring came gradually to Portland, more rain giving way to occasional sunshine, cherry blossoms appearing in the parks we'd walk through. Julia mentioned casually one afternoon that she'd ended things with someone she'd been seeing, someone I hadn't even known existed. The news surprised me more than it should have. I realized I'd been so focused on maintaining my own walls that I hadn't noticed she might have her own complications. She talked about it matter-of-factly, no drama, just acknowledging that some connections don't work out. I asked if she was okay, and she said that it had been coming for a while. Then she changed the subject to a new Thai restaurant that had opened nearby, and I let her, grateful not to dig deeper into territory that made me uncomfortable. The question came on a Saturday afternoon in early June, when the weather had turned unexpectedly warm and the whole city seemed to be outside celebrating. Julia had knocked on my door with takeout containers from that Thai place she'd mentioned weeks earlier, suggesting we eat on my small balcony since it would be a shame to waste the sunshine. I agreed, even though being outside meant hearing the sounds of other people enjoying the weather, couples walking by holding hands, families with children laughing. The kind of scenes that used to feel normal and now felt like glimpses into a life I'd lost access to. We ate pad thai and green curry while watching the neighborhood below. Julia talked about a project she was working on, logo design for a new bookstore in the Alberta Arts District. I listened and asked questions about her creative process, grateful for the distraction from my own thoughts. She had this way of describing her work that made it sound like solving puzzles, finding the exact right combination of shape and color to communicate something without words. I envied that certainty, that ability to create something definite and finished. Then, in the middle of a comfortable silence, she set down her fork and looked at me directly. Her expression was gentle but serious, the look of someone who'd been working up courage for something. "David, can I ask you something personal?" My stomach tightened immediately, instinct telling me to deflect, but I nodded. She took a breath. "Why are you still single?" The question landed with more force than her soft tone suggested. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious and maybe a little concerned. "You're kind and smart and funny when you let yourself be. You're clearly capable of caring about people. But you've built this wall around yourself and I don't understand why." The honest answer tried to stay trapped in my throat, years of practiced avoidance pushing back against the urge to actually explain. But something about the way Julia was looking at me, patient and open, made the truth feel less dangerous than continued silence. I set down my own food and stared at the railing of the balcony, needing to look at something other than her face while I found the words. "I was married," I said, and heard her slight intake of breath. Her name was Emma. We met in college, got married young, had all these plans. She was a veterinarian, worked at a clinic in Eugene. She was good at fixing broken things, always bringing home injured birds or stray cats that needed help. I smiled at the memory despite the ache it brought. I told Julia how Emma could spend hours with a frightened animal, patient and calm until they trusted her. How she believed everything deserved a chance to heal. Then I told her about the illness, how it came without warning. One day Emma mentioned feeling tired, dismissed it as stress from work. A few weeks later she was in the hospital for tests. The doctors used words like aggressive and limited options. I explained how we went from planning our future to counting days, How quickly everything we'd built together became focused on just trying to keep her alive a little longer. Julia's hand found mine on the table, but I couldn't look at her yet. Emma died 3 weeks after her diagnosis. I continued, my voice steadier than I expected. I was 29 years old, and suddenly I didn't know how to exist in a world where she wasn't. Everything we'd planned, everything we'd promised each other, just ended. I tried to keep working in Eugene, but everywhere I looked I saw her. The apartment we'd shared, the streets we'd walked, the future we were supposed to have. So I moved here thinking distance would help. I finally met Julia's eyes. Her face showed exactly what I'd feared, the kind of empathy that made my chest hurt. But what I didn't expect was recognition, like she understood something deeper than just my story. I kept talking because stopping felt impossible now. I know 3 years is a long time, and people probably think I should have moved on by now. But dating feels impossible. Not because I'm still in love with a ghost, though maybe part of me is. It's because I learned exactly how much it hurts to lose someone you love that completely. My heart survived it once, barely. I'm not sure it could survive it again, so I just don't risk it. I keep people at a distance where caring about them won't destroy me if something goes wrong. Julia squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to let fall. David, she said quietly, I'm so sorry. For Emma, for what you went through, for asking a question that brought all of that back up. I shook my head. You didn't do anything wrong. You've been a good friend, patient with my weird boundaries. You deserve to know why I am the way I am. She was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. Can I tell you something? When I was 24, I was engaged. His name was Trevor, and I thought we were going to build this amazing life together. Then I found out he'd been cheating on me for months with someone from his office. The betrayal broke something in me, not just trust in him, but trust in my own judgment. If I could be that wrong about someone I was planning to marry, how could I trust my feelings about anyone? So I started keeping things surface level. Dating people I knew wouldn't work out long term because that felt safer than risking real investment again. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the parallel she was drawing. We're both hiding, I said, just from different things. She nodded. I'm afraid of being fooled again. You're afraid of losing someone again. Different fears, same result. We've both decided that protection is more important than connection. The afternoon stretched into evening while we talked, really talked, in a way we never had before. Julia told me about the aftermath of her broken engagement, how she'd thrown herself into building her freelance career because work felt safer than people, how she dated casually but never let anyone close enough to actually hurt her. I told her about the grief counseling I'd tried and abandoned, about the well-meaning friends in Eugene who tried to set me up and couldn't understand why I kept refusing, about moving to Portland specifically because nobody here knew me as the guy whose wife died, and I could just be David, undefined by tragedy. We're quite the pair, Julia said with a sad smile. Both so scared of pain that we've made ourselves numb instead. I thought about that, about how accurate it was. Emma used to tell me that fear was just love trying to protect itself. At the time, I'd thought it was poetic. Now it felt like prophecy. What do we do with this? I asked. Now that we've both admitted we're hiding? Julia stood up, started gathering the takeout containers, needing movement to process. I don't know, she admitted, but I think we should figure it out. Because this, she gestured between us, this friendship we've built, it matters to me. And I think it matters to you too. More than either of us has wanted to admit. She was right, and that realization terrified me. Somewhere in the casual coffee mornings and easy conversations, Julia had slipped past my defenses. I cared about her in a way that went beyond friendly. And from the way she was looking at me, carefully hopeful despite everything I just told her about my fear of exactly this kind of caring, she felt something similar. The sky had turned deep purple, stars starting to appear. Julia touched my shoulder gently before heading toward my door. Think about it, she said. Think about whether maybe, possibly, we could try being scared together instead of alone. Then she was gone, back to her own apartment, leaving me standing on my balcony with my heart racing and my mind spinning with possibilities I'd convinced myself I could never allow again. I avoided Julia for 2 weeks after that conversation, which was harder than it sounds when you live in apartments separated by a single wall. I heard her moving around, heard her music playing, heard her leave for meetings and return home late at night. Each sound reminded me that I was being a coward, but knowing that didn't make me any braver. The problem wasn't that I didn't want to see her. The problem was that I wanted it too much, and wanting anything that intensely felt like standing at the edge of a cliff I'd already fallen from once before. Work became my excuse for everything. I took on extra projects, volunteered for the complicated assignments nobody else wanted, filled my calendar with video calls that stretched into evenings. My coworkers probably thought I was angling for a promotion. Really, I was just terrified of the silence that came when I stopped typing, the quiet moments when I'd think about Julia's words, think about whether maybe, possibly, we could try being scared together instead of alone. The idea pulled at something deep in my chest, equal parts hope and terror. On the 15th day, my laptop died completely. Not the kind of problem you can fix by restarting or checking cables, but the kind where the screen just goes black and stays that way no matter what you try. I had a presentation due the next morning, files I desperately needed, and a growing sense of panic that felt disproportionate to the actual crisis. Technology fails, you deal with it, you move on. Except I'd been holding myself together through routine and control, and suddenly both were gone. I stood there staring at the dead screen for a full minute before admitting I needed help. Julia had better equipment than me, professional-grade stuff for her design work. She'd let me use it before when I'd had minor technical problems. But asking meant facing her after 2 weeks of deliberate avoidance, meant acknowledging that I'd been hiding like a child who broke something and hoped nobody would notice. Her door was closed when I knocked, and for a second I thought maybe she wasn't home, that I could retreat back to my apartment and figure out some other solution. Then I heard footsteps and the door opened and Julia was standing there in paint-stained sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, hair pulled back messily, looking absolutely beautiful in a way that made my avoidance feel even more ridiculous. "Hey," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Hey," I replied, suddenly aware that I should have rehearsed what to say. "My laptop died and I have this presentation tomorrow, and I know I've been weird for the past 2 weeks, but I really need help and I'm sorry for showing up like this." The words tumbled out without grace or planning. Julia studied my face for a moment, then stepped back to let me in. "Come on," she said. "Let's see what we can do." Her apartment felt different somehow, or maybe I was different, more aware of every detail. The way she'd rearranged her furniture, the new prints on the wall, the half-finished painting on an easel near the window that I'd never seen before. She directed me to her desk where her computer sat with its multiple monitors and professional setup. "I'll make tea," she said. "You know the password." The casual intimacy of that, of her trusting me with access to her equipment and her space after I'd spent 2 weeks avoiding her, made my throat tight. I got to work recovering my files from cloud storage, rebuilding the presentation I'd been working on. Julia moved around her kitchen quietly, the familiar sounds of mugs and kettle and cabinet doors creating a soundtrack that felt both comforting and painful. When she brought me tea, she set it down without comment and settled on her couch with a book, giving me space to work but staying present. The gesture said more than words could have. 2 hours later, I'd salvaged everything and had the presentation in better shape than before the crash. I saved everything multiple times, paranoid about losing it again, then finally turned in the desk chair to face Julia. She'd been watching me, I realized, her book open but unread in her lap. "Thank you," I said, "for this and for not asking why I've been avoiding you." She closed the book, set it aside. "I know why you've been avoiding me, David. You're scared. I'm scared too." That simple admission broke something open in me. "I'm really good at being alone," I told her. "I've practiced for 3 years. I know how to wake up and go through the day and go to bed without needing anyone. It's safe. It's manageable. What I don't know how to do is care about someone again and trust that the universe won't just take them away." Julia got up, came over to where I was sitting, leaned against the desk facing me. "What if we start really small?" she suggested. "What if we don't try to figure out the whole scary future thing and just focus on right now?" "Right now I'm terrified," I admitted. "Right now I'm also terrified," she said. "So we're even." Her smile was tentative but real. I thought about Emma, about what she would say if she could see me now, paralyzed by fear of loss when she'd fought so hard just to have more time. She'd be furious with me for wasting 3 years being safe instead of being alive. That thought should have made me sad. But instead it felt like permission. What does starting small look like? I asked. Julia considered this. Maybe it looks like you stop avoiding me. Maybe we have dinner together once a week, actual dinner where we sit down and talk, not just take out while working. Maybe we're honest about the fact that this friendship has turned into something else, and we stop pretending otherwise. Maybe we admit that we're both broken in different ways and see if broken pieces can still fit together. I stood up, suddenly needing to be closer to her. The movement surprised us both. What if I hurt you? I asked quietly. What if something happens to me and you end up where I was 3 years ago? What if I let you in and then lose you the way I lost Emma and I can't survive it twice? Julia reached out, took both my hands in hers. What if we get hit by a bus tomorrow? What if the building catches fire? What if a meteor strikes Portland? We can't live our lives based on every terrible thing that might happen. David. That's not living. That's just slowly dying while our hearts still beat. She was right, and I'd known she was right for weeks. But hearing it stated so plainly made denial impossible. I'm not good at this, I warned her. At being open, at letting someone matter. I'll probably mess it up. I'll definitely get scared and want to run. Probably multiple times. Julia squeezed my hands. I'm not good at it either. I'll probably get suspicious and look for betrayal that isn't there. I'll definitely have moments where I convince myself you're going to leave. We're both disasters, David. But maybe we can be disasters together. I pulled her into a hug, sudden and tight, feeling her surprise before she relaxed against me. Her hair smelled like paint and shampoo, her body warm and solid and real. We stood like that for a long time, not kissing, not even really talking, just existing in the same space without walls between us. It felt terrifying and necessary and like coming up for air after being underwater for years. When we finally pulled apart, Julia's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. So she said, dinner. Tomorrow night. Actual dinner, not work dinner. Here or at your place doesn't matter. We sit down, we eat, we talk about things that matter. And we don't run away scared, at least not immediately. Deal? I nodded, my heart racing but my answer certain. Deal. That night I lay in bed listening to the sounds of Julia moving around next door. But instead of the usual loneliness those sounds brought, I felt something else. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. The idea that my story didn't have to end with Emma, that loving her and losing her could be a chapter instead of the whole book. It didn't make the fear go away. Fear that deep doesn't just disappear. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like maybe the fear didn't have to win. Dinner the next night was awkward in all the ways first dates are awkward, which felt absurd given that Julia and I had eaten together dozens of times. But this was different and we both knew it. She'd cooked actual food instead of ordering takeout, some kind of pasta dish with vegetables and herbs from the farmer's market. I brought flowers from the shop downstairs, which made her laugh and blush at the same time. We're really doing this, she said, setting them in a vase. We're really doing this, I confirmed, and my voice only shook a little. We talked about safe things at first. Her latest client project, my presentation that had gone well despite the laptop disaster, a movie we'd both seen and had different opinions about. But gradually the conversation shifted deeper. Julia told me more about Trevor, about the specific ways his betrayal had damaged her ability to trust. How she'd found texts on his phone, confronted him, watched him lie to her face before finally admitting it. How she'd felt stupid for not seeing the signs earlier, for believing his excuses about working late and weekend business trips. I told her more about Emma too, details I'd never shared with anyone in Portland. How she'd stayed optimistic even when the doctors stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort. How she'd made me promise not to waste my life being sad. A promise I'd clearly broken. How the hardest part wasn't the dramatic hospital moments but the small ones after, waking up and forgetting for a second that she was gone, then remembering all over again. Julia listened without trying to fix anything, just bearing witness to pain I'd carried alone for too long. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of progress and setbacks. We had good days where everything felt natural and right, where I'd catch myself laughing at something Julia said and realize I felt happy, actually happy, not just content or distracted. Then we'd have hard days where my anxiety would spike over nothing, where I'd see a couple holding hands and suddenly feel like I was betraying Emma's memory. Julia had her own hard days, moments where she'd withdraw, and I could see her waiting for me to prove her fears right, to lie or leave or reveal some hidden betrayal. We learned to talk through it. That was new for both of us, the idea that problems could be solved with conversation instead of distance. When I had a panic attack at 2 in the morning, convinced something terrible was about to happen to Julia, she came over in her pajamas and sat with me until I could breathe normally again. When she got quiet and distant after meeting some of my coworkers, convinced one of them was flirting with me, I asked her directly what was wrong, and we worked through the insecurity together instead of letting it fester. 3 months in, Julia's parents came to visit from California. Meeting them felt enormous, like crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. Her mom was warm and talkative, her dad quiet but observant. They took us to dinner at a nice restaurant in the Pearl, and I found myself being evaluated in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Julia had clearly told them about my history because her mom mentioned being sorry for my loss in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. Afterward, walking back to our building through streets wet with recent rain, Julia took my hand. "That went well," she said, sounding relieved. "Your parents are nice," I replied. "Your dad asked me a lot of questions about my intentions." She laughed. "He's protective." I told him you were worth protecting me, even from my own fear. The weight of that statement settled between us, heavy with meaning. By late summer, we'd fallen into rhythms that felt less like trying and more like living. Julia kept her apartment but spent most nights at mine, or I'd stay at hers. We hiked on weekends, explored the coast, found small towns neither of us had visited before. She met my few friends from work, integrated seamlessly into my carefully small social circle. I met more of her friends, the ones who'd been suspicious of me initially but gradually accepted that I was serious about her. The panic attacks became less frequent, though they never disappeared completely. Some nights I'd wake up absolutely certain that something had happened to Julia, and I'd have to see her breathing beside me or hear her voice before the fear would release its grip. She never made me feel weak or broken for these moments. She'd just remind me that she was here, that we were both okay, that fear was allowed to exist without being in charge. Julia had her own struggles. Sometimes she'd get quiet and withdrawn, and I learned to recognize it as her brain trying to protect her by creating distance before I could abandon her first. We developed a code phrase for these moments. "Are you running?" I'd ask gently, and she'd either say yes and we'd talk about why, or no and explain what was actually bothering her. The honesty felt revolutionary, like we'd discovered a language most people never learned. 1 year after that first terrifying conversation on my balcony, Julia suggested we take a trip to the coast for the weekend. We drove out to Cannon Beach, walked along the sand with the famous haystack rock rising from the water. The air smelled like salt and possibility. We found a quiet spot away from the tourists and sat watching the waves crash against the shore, the sound ancient and relentless and somehow comforting. "I've been thinking," Julia said, and I turned to look at her. "About what?" "About how we started this whole thing scared and broken, and somehow we've built something real anyway. About how Emma was right that you shouldn't waste your life being sad, and how Trevor was wrong that love means trusting blindly without paying attention. About how maybe we've both learned something important." I pulled her closer, her head resting on my shoulder. "What have we learned?" I asked. "That being brave doesn't mean not being scared," she said. "It means being scared and choosing to try anyway. It means trusting that even if the worst happens, even if we lose each other somehow, the time we had would have been worth the risk." I thought about that, about Emma and the years we'd had before cancer stole our future. Would I trade those years to avoid the pain of losing her? Never. Not even for a second.